Hello. Uh, Good evening. I'm Richard Nobles, and I serve as chair of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee with the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic media. Linda Heisman-Powell.
Here. Present.
David Stevens.
Here.
Abby Callis.
Here.
Mark Goodman.
Here.
Matthew Gulker.
Present.
Edward Hunter. I don't think Ned is here yet. Tiffany Johnson. I have not seen her. Sarah Kirk.
Here.
Christopher Leonard.
Here.
Jay Middleton.
Here.
And Doug Wright. I do not see Doug present. I note the following staff members are also present: David Fye.
Here.
And Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Richard. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals wishing to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. No time has been reserved for public comment, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the BSRB YouTube channel or also the conference call. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the conference call. On August 22nd, 2024, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line "request for the agenda," and it will be sent to you. The agenda, the notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office by sending an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line before we got started. It is active, but no one is on the call. But if I hear someone beep over, I will let you know.
Thank you, David. This meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first agenda item, and that is to approve the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Moved.
I approve it.
There were 4 people, let's say Linda and Mark, as moving and second. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign. Well, next item on our agenda is to welcome our newest member of the advisory committee, and Dr. Christopher Leonard. Dr. Leonard, would you give us a little bit of would you tell us a little bit about yourself? I'm stumbling over words here.
It'd be a pleasure. My name is Christopher Leonard. Most people just call me Chris. I'm a licensed psychologist working at Wichita State University's Counseling and Psychological Services. I've been at Wichita State since 2013 as a doc intern. And then in 2017, 2018, I spent a year over in Ohio at Bowling Green State University. And then I came back in 18, and I've been the director for a number of years now here, and I was associate director when I came back as well. So just excited to be part of the board, part of the advisory committee, and be assistants to the board and things like that, and really help the public.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for volunteering your time, and we are excited to have you. And there will be a number of things that we will discuss over the course of the evening, and I hope that you are able to kind of jump in and roll right through things with us. I do want to acknowledge the presence of a few members that have joined us in Doug Wright and Tiffany Johnson. And I saw Ned, but he seems to have logged off. But Ned Hunter was also here. I'd like to now move to the next item and review and approve the minutes from the last advisory committee meeting on the 13th of August, 2024. Are there any amendments that anyone would like to make to the minutes from our last meeting? Seeing none, I take a motion to approve the minutes from the 13th of August, 2024.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Jay moved. Do I have a second? David Stevens seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
And those opposed, same sign. All right, the minutes have been approved. I'd like to move on to our next item, and that is Dave Five's executive report, executive director's report. Dave, please go ahead.
All right, thank you, Richard. So at every advisory committee meeting, I try to update the members of the advisory committee about some high-level items in terms of BSRB operations, and I also try to keep you informed of items from the last board meeting as well. So we'll start first with some operations updates. You may recall we have been broadcasting all the board meetings and all the advisory committee meetings, and then there have been a few special meetings that we have broadcast on the YouTube channel or uploaded after the fact. And that was started back in January of 2021. Partially out of necessity because of the pandemic, but also as a way to provide more outreach to the work the board was doing and the conversations the advisory committees were having, to invite more people to be part of those discussions and to know about all the work the board is doing. And so since that time, we have broadcast live or uploaded, I think, around 175 meetings, and those meetings have now been broadcast over 10,000 times. So I just want to compliment all the work that you do. The work that you do on this advisory committee and some of you as board members is really valuable, and it is being noticed. And we do have more conversation with individuals. They are emailing the BSRB with questions and participating in this process, and that's a really positive thing. So I just want to provide that feedback to all of you, and thank you again for all the work that you do. In terms of a couple other outreach items, we had a couple of unique meetings a couple weeks ago. Prior to the board's all-day planning meeting, we held a all-day, well, not an all-day, but we held a special meeting that was an informational forum for educators. And then the following day, we did an informational forum for employers of mental health professionals. We started doing these two meetings last year. Prior to this, many years ago, we had a physical roundtable discussion with some educators, but based on the growth of programs and a lot of these programs being online, and just how spread out across the state they are, we thought it'd be helpful to reach individuals by doing it online. And so last year we had about 30 to 35 people who registered for that. This year, I believe we had a little over 40 for the educator forum. And we provided information in terms of updates from the BSRB, updates on multi-state compacts, and then also some recent changes to regulations the board has put through. And we opened up for questions and comments and listened if there were any comments or questions from those educators. I know that we missed some individuals. We didn't have a perfect list, but we are looking to expand that list and add more people to the forum, and we plan to do that educational meeting again next year. The following day, we had an informational forum for employers of mental health professionals, and this was a brand new endeavor that we started last year. We had, again, 30 to 35 people last year. This year, I think we had over 60 who attended that meeting, or at least RSVP'd for it. Really positive to see individuals wanting to learn information that we're trying to provide for the agency. We are really trying to have more open dialogue with individuals and trying to learn about any priorities or issues that they're experiencing, but also making sure that they are aware of all the changes and ways in which the board has modernized the requirements for licensure and tried to help in terms of ease of use and just new conversations based on changing technology and things like that. So both of those meetings were well received. Those both took place the last week in September. And we were able to record those meetings, and we have uploaded those to the BSRB YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to go back and watch those, they're about an hour long, but the content is very similar. So if you watch one, you're probably going to be seeing a lot of the same content if you watch the other. Now moving to the BSRB board meeting. The board usually meets for about 3 hours every other month. Once a year, the board likes to come together in person and have an all-day planning meeting. So this year, what they decided to do was, instead of having the regular board meeting in September, they decided on Sunday evening, they would have 2 hours for more of the standard business items. And then the following day, on Saturday or on Monday, they would have an all-day planning meeting and talk about items relevant for the legislative agenda or topics that just needed more in-depth discussion. So that was September 29th and 30th in Lawrence, Kansas. We do try to move that meeting around the state. In the time that I have been there, the first year we couldn't hold in-person meetings, so it was done online. The second year it was done in Kansas City, the third year Wichita, and then this year it was in Lawrence. So we do try to move that meeting and let more people have the opportunity to sit in on the board meeting if they would choose to do so. But I wanted to give you some highlights from that meeting. So we did receive public comment in written form from an individual who had concerns about the licensing examination for psychology, the EPPP, specifically the EPPP2, and that was Dr. Krista Edwards. And so her comments are posted on the website if you would like to go and review her comments about the EPPP. Additionally, there were the regular professions reports. We also had the report about licensing totals, and I'm happy to report that we continue to see an increase in overall licensing between the 7 agents or 7 professions that we regulate. Looking at old business from that meeting, there was a conversation about advisory committee member expectations. So all of you are familiar with the advisory committee policy, and it's very short. It's just about a page in length. And a lot of that document focuses on the role of the advisory committee to assist the work of the board by providing recommendations back to the board, or to discuss items the board has recommended the advisory committee review and discuss. Some of the language also talks about the way that the advisory committee will consider candidates when you have openings on the advisory committee. However, the expectations in terms of membership in the advisory committee is a little unclear. So for example, there is a line in the advisory committee policy that says the same policies and procedures that relate to board members should also relate to advisory committee members, but that line has never been fleshed out. There are some differences for sure between board members and advisory committee members. For example, the statutes say that board members have to live in the state of Kansas. The advisory committee policy is silent on that topic. The expectations of board members document says that board members will not, it's expected that board members will not receive disciplinary violations. There is no language about disciplinary violations in the advisory committee policy. Additionally, it says in the expectations of board members document that their board members should have no more than 1 unexcused absence per year. And the advisory committee policy, it doesn't really talk to absences, and it doesn't clarify anything about what would be an approved or excused absence versus unexcused. And so there's a few of these different things that the board had a conversation if they wanted to add more clarifying language, or if they wanted to leave it alone. Another item was whether or not advisory committee members should all be licensed under the board, or if that's something that needed to be in there or not. So the board did have some conversation. They had a couple comments about a few different topics, and they asked us to draft some of that language and bring it back. So we will be bringing that back at the November board meeting. And if the board does vote on any permanent changes to the advisory committee policy, we will keep all of you updated as well. Also at that meeting, the board appointed new members of 3 of the advisory committees: the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, and the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee. There was also an appointment of a new SIPAC commissioner. So as you may recall, we have joined 3 multi-state compacts for the professions regulated by the BSRB. The first that we joined was SIPAC for licensed psychologists. Then we joined professional counselors, multi-state compact last year. And most recently this year, we joined a social work multi-state compact. So basically, each of those compacts calls for the state to appoint an individual to serve as the commissioner for the state, who has the role of attending meetings and representing the state at those types of meetings. I have been serving as the compact commissioner for SIPAC, but with the social work compact just having been enacted, there is work to be done in terms of having the rules committee meet and trying to get that compact set up. So the board appointed me to be the new commissioner for the social work compact. But in taking that role, I am stepping out of my role as SIPAC commissioner. And so I'm happy to report at the most recent board meeting, the board did appoint Richard Nobles to be the new SIPAC commissioner for the state of Kansas. So really happy to see that. And thank you, Richard, for taking on that responsibility. Richard is not able to attend the annual meeting that's going to take place in November. So what I had the board ask the board to do was I will attend that meeting as my last meeting as SIPAC commissioner. And then following the annual meeting in November, Richard will become the SIPAC commissioner for the state of Kansas. So thanks again, Richard, and look forward to working with you in your new role. Moving to another note about the social work multi-state compact. So SIPAC does not allow this, but the social work compact allows the board to designate a backup for the compact if the commissioner is unavailable. So on the social work one, you could have someone ready in case the commissioner is unexpectedly absent or can't attend the meeting. And so the board did go ahead and appoint the senior member of the board, who is a social worker, and that's Andrea Perdomo Morales, to be the backup social worker in terms of the compact for social work. So she is appointed to that role as well. Looking to some of the items that the board discussed in terms of recommendations from the advisory committee, there was a recommendation that was from both the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee and also the Master's Level Psychology Advisory Committee. This had to do with the test, the EPPP. Currently, there is a requirement in different states that if those states choose to use the EPPP as the license requirement, then individuals will need to pass that test. And they have the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB, has developed something called the EPPP2, and that is described as a skills-based test, whereas the EPPP is described as more of a knowledge-based test. And ASPPB has put out that their board has decided if any states would like to continue to use the EPPP as a licensing examination after January 1st of 2026, they will need to require their applicants pass not only the EPPP, which will be renamed EPPP Part 1, but also the EPPP Part 2. And so basically, we have known that this was something they put in place. They did not give the opportunity for states to vote on this provision. It was something decided by the board of ASPPB. But that is then something that is coming up. But there has been a number of states who've had some difficulty and believe their legislatures will not be able to enact Part 2. And there are also concerns about a number of issues related to the EPPP Part 2. And so at the last meeting, the Texas Licensing Board for Psychology had put forward a proposed bylaw amendment to the bylaws of ASPPB. And to briefly summarize that bylaw amendment, the takeaway is that if that bylaw amendment passes, it will allow states the option to require passage of EPPP Part 2 or not. It will not be something that ASPPB will be mandating that all states will have to require passage of both tests to use the EPPP. So recommendation to the board at the last board meeting from both the LP Advisory Committee and the Master's Level Psychology Advisory Committee was a recommendation to support the proposed bylaw amendment from Texas at the annual meeting. And the board discussed that, and the board did vote to support that bylaw amendment. So at the annual meeting, I will be speaking in favor of that proposed bylaw amendment when it comes to that part of the meeting. Moving on to the next item, the board received a recommendation from the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee. There are currently 12 board members in the statute, and the statute does say what individuals can serve in each board member role. For example, it says there will be 2 social workers on the board, 2 licensed psychologists on the board, and then it says the other professional members, and then it says 4 public members, but it does not specifically name someone from the behavior analyst profession. Behavior analysis was added, I believe, in 2014, and we began to license those individuals in 2016. And so last year, in a bill before the legislature, the board had requested an additional board member be added for the behavior analyst profession. And this year, there was another recommendation from the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee to add a board member for the behavior analyst profession. And so the board discussed that and also voted to support that recommendation to request the additional board member spot for behavior analysis in a bill before the legislature next year. Another item before the board had to do with a recommendation from the Social Work Advisory Committee. So I mentioned the board put forward a large bill last year that was 2023 sub for Senate Bill 131. And one of the items that was amended into that bill, this was not a recommendation by the board, but the legislature amended something into the bill that changed the requirements for individuals pursuing licensure as a clinical social worker. Prior to the amendment, there was language in the statute that basically said for individuals pursuing that level of licensure, they had to take 5 specific classes and diagnosis and treatment, so 15 credit hours. And they also had to attain the 3,000 hours of postgraduate experience, including the 1,500 hours of direct client contact and diagnosing and treating. The language that was amended into it struck the requirements of 4 of the 5 classes, leaving only psychopathology as a requirement in that section of the statute. And it also said of the 1,500 hours that are required in diagnosis and treatment, the language was changed so that it wasn't 1,500 hours in diagnosis and treatment, but it was 1,500 hours, including but not limited to diagnosis and treatment. And that created a vague standard for us to be able to evaluate in terms of those training plans and the hours people are accruing. And so the Social Work Advisory Committee had significant concerns that individuals with these changes would not have appropriate education or training, diagnosing and treating, but then would be able to do that independently. And so what they recommended to the board was 2 things. One, restoring the coursework requirements and the old language that talked about 1,500 hours diagnosing and treating. And then the second recommendation was that if there are individuals that would like the highest level license, that would be an independent level license, but would not be eligible to diagnose and treat independently, there are some states that have something called an advanced generalist license. And so the Social Work Advisory Committee, their second recommendation was for the board to introduce in statute in a bill, essentially, developing a new level of specialist social work license, and this would be the advanced generalist. So that was taken before the board, both of these recommendations. The board asked the board members on the committee to see if they could set up a meeting with the National Association of Social Workers in Kansas to see if perhaps we could find common ground to work on some of these items with that group. And so we have reached out to them to see if we could set up a meeting to kind of try to work together on some of these topics. We are currently having trouble with schedules and trying to find a time that we can meet before the next board meeting in November. So we are attempting to do that. And that is what the board asked to do, is to table that item until November and then try to have the individuals meet together before that board. Another item from the most recent board meeting, there was a recommendation from the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee that had to do with the language preparing for the practice. To kind of summarize this item, in the construction of Act statute for most of the professions, there is a little bit of language carving out individuals that are not required to be licensed when they are providing certain services. And it's very specific in terms of what categories those individuals would fall in, because in most cases, individuals would need to be licensed. However, it does say that there would be students and interns that would be able to provide services without being licensed, but it says students, interns, and individuals preparing for the practice of addiction counseling. And that language, preparing for the practice of addiction counseling, was somewhat vague. And it is not included in all of the statutes. And so we tried to research to see if there was something significant or specific that it was addressing. And we couldn't really find a reference to what groups that would really relate to. But we do want to be diligent in terms of knowing, you know, what our statutes really mean and what it is referencing there. And so it appears that language is similarly in the marriage and family therapy statute. We don't have any real good information on specifically which individuals it would relate to for that profession either. So what we posed to the advisory committee was, you know, this term really needs to be defined so we have a good definition of it. Or if you don't have a good definition of it, perhaps we could strike this from the statute if it's not really affecting individuals that it, you know, should be covering. So the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee decided to go ahead and strike that language from the statute. And then the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee was asked to discuss that topic and then to come back to the board to see what their stance should be, if they also recommend striking it from the statute or if they want to take a different perspective. Additionally, there was one more recommendation for the board, and that had to do with the bill that passed last year, added a new student temporary license for the licensed addiction counseling profession. This is the first student temporary license the BSRB has introduced, but it essentially would be a bridge to help people get into the workforce and the addiction counseling profession. It was created to allow individuals who have 60 hours of coursework in addiction counseling or a related field, or at least with an emphasis in addiction counseling or a related field, that are on their way to a 4-year degree, ultimately pursuing a licensed addiction counselor license. It would allow them the ability to get a temporary 2-year license after they had attained those 60 hours. They would have to have an agreement with their school and then an employer. They'd have to work in certain facilities under supervision, but it would allow them the ability to get a temporary license as a student, and it could be renewed once. And so we've had a lot of individuals pursue this. It's been very successful from our perspective. We've had, I think, over 40 people just get that in the last year. However, there are other categories of individuals that it might make sense for them to also be eligible for a student temporary license. For example, if there's individuals who have attended a program that is not in addiction counseling or a related field, but they have finished their, let's say, bachelor's degree, and then they are enrolled in a program that is based on addiction counseling. Those individuals seem like they would fit under this category as well, and it would be helpful for them to be able to have a student temporary license. And so the board discussed some different scenarios for other groups that might fit under that category, and decided to basically say that would be something they would like to pursue. And they asked for some language to be brought back to show which groups that would cover, so they could take a look at that at the November board. There is still a conversation about potentially a recommendation for a graduate level student temporary license for addiction counseling, but that is something that the advisory committee will continue to discuss. So no recommendation at this time. Some other updates from the board meeting. We gave the board some good information about licensure process for the BSRB. We wanted to kind of break down the different ways that some individuals apply for licensure and kind of show them the steps that staff take right now and applicants take under our current setup, knowing that in the next 2 years, we are moving to a new licensing model under a new platform called Acela. The state entered into an agreement with that company to develop an enterprise licensing system. And so a lot of our processes right now that are not the most efficient processes, we think will be improved over the next 2 years as we have more of these different pieces that are integrated together. For example, right now, when someone applies for licensure, they could send us a check or a money order, or they could go ahead and enter their payment through the payment portal on the website. But that payment has to be manually matched up to their application. And then we get the applications physically through the mail versus being submitted electronically. We have individuals that sometimes will skip questions or miss questions. We have to follow up with people. And then there's individuals that, may forget to send something with their packet as well. And so there's just a lot of steps that are kind of missed, and there's just different timeframes. Some of these things we have no control over. When someone takes the test and passes the test for some of the licensing professions, sometimes we get those score reported to us really quickly. Other professions, we get the score reports about once a month. And so we wanted to put a spotlight on the different steps and the different time periods, so the board would have an idea of all the different parts of someone applying for licensure. And so I think we got some positive feedback on that. And I also provided information to the board. Given some of those timeframes that are out of our control, it is difficult to quantify the average length of time for when someone applies for licensure versus when they get licensed. It's not a process where basically they hand us everything and then it's how quickly can we get through this packet. We really get things in pieces, and then sometimes people get a window of time for them to take the test, and then we hope they pass the first time, but if they don't, then it's on them to schedule a test again in the future. So there's all these different factors, but given everything, we wanted to provide the board some way to measure how we've done as a licensing body the last few years. So given all the things that I talked about, we still looked at different groups, individuals who applied with a regular application and individuals who applied through the reciprocity process. And looking at those two groups, comparing fiscal year 22 to 23 to 24, we did show that we had a significant improvement in our licensing processing timeframe. It decreased from 22 to 23, and it decreased again from 23 to 24. During that time period, we have improved our technology. We have added some additional staff members, and we've been able to move them around to different areas so that they can really focus on problem areas. And so we have shown improvement there. We're still working on a way that we can really quantify that in a clean way, but we want to provide that back to the board. So we are seeing some improvement but we will think we will see a lot more improvement once we move to the Acela platform here in a couple of years. We also provided updates on the multi-state compacts. And then also we touched upon the educator forum and employer forum. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of feedback from those forums. We hope that we can continue to build these relationships and get more people talking. This is a good opportunity for both groups, the employers and the educators, to be able to provide feedback that we could transfer to the board. I want everyone to know the board is listening to comments and they would like to take these things into consideration. They really are working hard to make improvements. So we're going to continue to encourage people to attend those meetings and then also provide more feedback. In terms of more items from the all-day planning meeting, there was a discussion about supervision requirements for individuals seeking a clinical level of licensure for professional counseling and marriage and family therapy. Right now, these are the two professions that have a board-approved supervisor requirement. They also have some language that allows individuals from other professions to provide supervision, but only under extenuating circumstances. And so we had a conversation about might we be able to explore some other possibilities. And so we had the advisory committees for both groups take back some ideas to look at their supervision requirements to see if they wanted to pursue any kind of increased flexibility for individuals when choosing their supervisors. There was also a discussion about an expedited application review process. We have been struggling to come up with a specific model for that. We've been working on trying to put that together, but there really aren't any state agencies that I'm aware of in Kansas that have something set up like that. And I've asked my contacts in other states if they have something like that, and I just hear crickets. And so we're trying to put together good policies and come up with something really positive, but it's hard when we are trying to design something from scratch that will be beneficial. And so I think, in talking about it with the board, I think there were some good ideas. I think we have something that we can put together, at least in print, for the board to review. So we'll bring that back for the board at the November board meeting. Some other items the board discussed. There is a rule out for public comment in Texas right now, which allows the Texas Licensing Board the ability to remediate small deficiencies when you have applicants for licensure. This does not supersede the statutes, so the statute requirements would still be in place. But what this regulation would do for Texas, at least, is if it went into effect, it would allow them, if there is a minor deficiency in the regulation, instead of just denying the person for licensure, they might be able to come up with an alternative solution for that person to do some additional hours, maybe take some additional coursework or something versus denying the license outright. So we brought it to the board. There are a few unique language differences. So we're going to kind of adjust the language with legal counsel and bring it back for the board to review at the November board meeting. Another item that we brought to the board had to do with reviewing academic programs independent of an applicant for licensure. And what I mean by this is if you look at the statutes and regulations for the BSRB, they are all through the lens of an applicant. So when we have someone apply for licensure, we don't have control to tell a program you need to require this or you need to do this. The universities and colleges, they are free to design their programs however they want. But if someone wants to qualify for licensure, it's on us to look at the statutes and regulations and see did the person attend a program whose program met these standards. And so
it appears that we have lost Dave. I'm unsure. Leslie?
Richard, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, now.
Okay, my apologies. I had a little technical issue there. And you can still hear me, okay? Is that right?
Yes, I can
Okay.
hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. Hopefully this is just a temporary thing, but yeah, we do have some schools that reach out to us who ask us to review their programs and provide an opinion if their program meets the qualifications for licensure. The issue is that for us to use staff time to do that level of review, there's no compensation for us to use our staff time to do that work. However, in Missouri, they have set up a program where essentially they can accept a fee from a person or from a school that would allow the board to do an assessment of the program and offer an opinion without having an applicant for licensure from that program. And so We brought it to the board. There was positive support for this. Additionally, if we have other revenue streams, this would make it a little easier for us to decrease license fees on actual applicants. And we can also see that there will be some programs that would like that level of assurance. This would not be a requirement from any school, but if they would like to have this, we want to provide them the option to do that in a way that is structured, that does compensate us for the use of our staff time. So that is one item. Another item would be more of a technical issue. We have a disciplinary statute that allows the board to assess things like limiting a license when someone has a disciplinary infraction. We can also fine or deny a license or suspend the license or revoke a license. But there's a list of reasons that give the board the ability to do that. We would like to expand that to include not meriting the public trust. And the reason for this is that if we have an individual who applies for licensure and there are concerns, but we think the person could be okay to be licensed as long as there was some oversight, like some supervision, we would like to be able to impose some of those restrictions in those cases too. And so that is something we'll be pursuing just to give the board some other options to be able to license some individuals as long as there's appropriate oversight. And then as far as pre-approved continuing education, we currently allow individuals to apply to the BSRB to become a pre-approved continuing education provider for the social work profession. They can do that either to become a pre-approved provider or to do that for a specific program. This is not a requirement, but some entities like to do that. So they can hold that out as advertising, basically to provide some assurance to individuals for that course, or for just themselves that they are a pre-approved provider for the BSRB. And so right now we just have it for one profession, but we can see the value in opening that up to other professions. And now we are moving to the CE broker system for doing our auditing for a lot of the people who have records of continuing education. And so there is a way in CE broker for us also to have a way for providers to submit their material for review as well. So it seemed like the right time to open that up. And so that is something that we're asking the board to put forward for the 2025 legislative session. There's a technical item for the board that they reviewed in terms of reconciling two fee statutes for the professional counseling profession, but that's more of a technical issue. And then the last item I'll just kind of highlight here in my report is that we have had an ongoing conversation with the board about the fees of the BSRB. So you may recall, we've talked before that the BSRB is a fee-funded agency. We don't receive any money for operations from the state general fund. We work on a balance. And so we have one fee, or we have one fund, and all the money we receive goes into that one fund. And then each year, the legislature puts a limit on how much we can spend on a year-to-year basis. And if we don't spend it, it stays in that fund. And by statute, we also contribute 10% of all the revenue we receive up to $100,000 per year back to the state to help fund operations. And so our fee fund balance had been growing in past years, and the board implemented some really aggressive fee decreases back in 2019. I believe these were like $50 decreases in application fees and $50 decreases in license renewal fees. And they were put in place with the intention to draw down the balance of the fee fund slowly over time in a responsible way. Since that time, we have seen our numbers continue to grow in terms of overall licensees. And so while I think it would have drawn it down faster if we would have stayed pretty stationary in terms of overall licensees, our licensees have continued to increase, which is great. And so we have a little more flexibility to consider other fee decreases. Last year, the board voted to decrease most temporary license fees. Some were as high as $175. Now they are all down to $50. They're also 2 years in length versus 1 year in length, which is positive for applicants. The board also voted to decrease the fee for individuals wanting to reinstate their licenses. That used to basically be double renewal fee, and now it is just the cost of a renewal fee if you've been out of that profession for at least a year. But I think there is some flexibility to consider, at least for a short period of time, further fee decreases. So we presented information to the board. Our fee fund balance had been as high as about $2.1 million. It's now about $1.8 million. Our year-to-year expenditures are right around 1.1. And so our goal is to draw the balance down to about 1 year of expenditures. And so what the board voted to do at the board meeting was to lower original license fees by $50. And so it's a pretty significant decrease, but it is the first fee that a lot of individuals are paying when they get their permanent license. And so for the psychology profession, your fee structure is a little bit different. So it'll be a $50 decrease of the application fee versus the original license fee, but it will decrease that amount by $50. And so we anticipate this will be around a decrease in revenue of about $75,000 per year. So it's probably not sustainable for the long term, but at least for a period of time of maybe 3 to 4 years, we should be able to provide some relief for individuals when they're entering the professions. And we're trying to be responsive to the legislature and their concerns too about the balance in our fee fund. And so with that fee decrease, it'll be something we can put in regulation over the next few months. But I think between all the fee decreases we've done in the last few years, I would challenge any state agency in Kansas to show they've been more responsive to conversation about fee decreases in the BSRB. So we are really trying to help individuals become licensed and support them in good, positive ways. And this is, I think, one more way that the board is trying to do that. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions.
I do have a question regarding the number of licensed psychologists now in the state. How many approximately are there now?
That is a good question, and I can pull that number for you. I believe the rough total probably is right around somewhere between 1,050 to 1,100, but it might be just slightly above that number.
It's about 1,100 psychologists.
Appreciate that. Just wondering.
Oh, thank you. Anyone else have any questions for Dave regarding his executive director's report? I would like to just briefly acknowledge our advisory committee and the work that you all have done, especially with respect to the EPPP discussion that will be held at the ASPPB meeting. For those members that were not here for our August meeting, we had a discussion, a pretty in-depth discussion about the proposal from Texas, and that the information that was gathered from that discussion was presented to the board, as David said, during our September retreat. So I just want to thank you all for participating in the discussion and making the recommendation that as Kansas, we will support the amendment that's being proposed by Texas. And secondly, I'd like to acknowledge Linda Heitzman-Powell, because she is the chair of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, and she has been spearheading over the course of this year the matter of getting a member from that committee onto the BSRB. So thank you, Linda, for your steadfastness in doing that work.
And thanks for your support.
No, absolutely. That being said, we can move on to our next agenda item, and that is an update on the SIPAC multi-state compact.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. I did send sort of a late document to you all. I sent out the materials for the meeting, and then just a little bit later, I got one additional document, but it was the most recent report from the SIPAC Commission. They tend to put out a quarterly newsletter. So we did receive the newsletter from October of 2024. It just kind of summarizes a little bit of the upcoming meetings for SIPAC, including that annual meeting I discussed that'll be taking place November 18th and 19th, and that will be in Washington, D.C. So it will be an in-person meeting. Additionally, there's some information in terms of SIPAC by the numbers. Across the entire United States, there are 12,251 individuals who have applied for the authorization and been granted that to do telepsychology in other states. In terms of the ability to provide physical in-person psychology, That is the temporary practice, and about 758 individuals have applied for that. And there's a lot of crossover on that. So I would guess that most of these 758 are individuals who also applied for the telepsychology authorization to practice. But you can kind of see how popular the SIPAC authorizations have been in every state. Not all members of these states entered at the same time, so that also is a factor. You know, the ones who've been in SIPAC the longest may have a higher number. In Kansas, you can kind of see right now our number is 99, and what that means is that there are 99 psychologists. You have to have a permanent license in your home state, so they all have a license in Kansas as a licensed psychologist, and then they have applied to the SIPAC Commission for an authorization to do telepsychology. And then 8 people have applied and granted authorization to do the limited days of in-state service. So just wanted to share this information with you. As I mentioned before, the annual meeting is coming up in November. And so I'll be attending that meeting, and I'll inform them as well about the change in our commissioner. But I believe Richard is fully capable of being a great commissioner for SIPAC. And we will continue to have information on the BSRB website for general questions. And then Richard will be providing updates when he attends some of the meetings for the SIPAC Commission. So that's it for now, and I'll keep you updated after the annual meeting to see if there's any changes from that meeting.
Any questions for Dave regarding what's going on with SIPAC? Thank you very much, Dave. I'll move us on to our next agenda item. We are at old business, and the first item under old business is to continue our discussion regarding educational requirements for psychologists. And I'll have Dave and Leslie lead us off here.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So this was something that was driven by the board. You may recall the board had a discussion that we had a couple of advisory committee or a couple of public members of the board over the years who have viewed the information on the BSRB website and have expressed that it would be valuable as a good resource for members of the public to be able to get more information on the differences between the professions. We do have some connections between the 7 professions we have, but we have different tiers of licensure for a lot of the professions, and there can be some confusion by members of the public. You know, what is a professional counselor versus a marriage and family therapist? What is a difference between a psychologist and a social worker, you know? And so we've had, initially we considered trying to put some general language on the website, but then we thought, you know, that the best way to start this might be just to have each of the advisory committees and individuals who practice in these areas be able to weigh in and provide some language that we thought would be helpful for us to add to the website. So this is not something that would replace the statutory definitions. Those legal technical definitions are still really valuable. This is more of something where we're trying to put together a paragraph or two to help members of the public really understand the difference between the professions. And
Dave, I think you have gone to new business under, that's A under new business. Under old business, it's the educational requirements, but I would like for us to eventually get to that agenda item because I think it's really fruitful to have a discussion about it.
You are correct. My apologies about that, but just put a note in that and remember that setup for the discussion on that point. So that's a teaser. No, you are correct. Under old business, we have had an ongoing discussion about the requirements for licensure, and you all were sent a copy of KAR 102-1-12 educational requirements. So I did mention that there is a difference between the statutes, which we get when a bill is enacted, it becomes part of the law, and that is the statutes or KSAs. Within that, the board has the ability to promulgate regulations which have the effect of law, but those sometimes help to really flesh out the details within the statutory framework. And so we had a few different presenters, and we have had guests provide public comment at the last few meetings about possible changes to KAR 102-1-12, the educational requirements. There was one specific change that I think the advisory committee was receptive of And Leslie did mark up a copy of the regulations. She provided that to me, and I'll go ahead and just kind of share my screen here, and Leslie can describe the change to the regulation that she did, so you can kind of look at that one potential change. And Leslie, feel free to start describing it while I go ahead and pull that up.
Okay, so in section B, it originated, the regulation states that someone has to, if an APA program, it's on page 2, Dave. If an APA program, if someone comes from an APA program, they also have to have at least 24 semester credit hours in residence at the institution, face to face, breathing the same air at the institution with core faculty. And the committee discussed APA accreditation and that being the high standard and removing that requirement. So that has been struck. And then, so if someone can't, if in this version, if someone comes from an APA accredited program, they could be approved for licensure without having done the 24 hours of coursework in residence. If someone is not from an APA program, then the program has to meet all the requirements listed after that. And that does include completing 24 hours in assessment and treatment in residence at the institution. So it doesn't change if a person is from a program that is not APA accredited, it doesn't change anything. This would only apply to people from an APA accredited program. Then they would not have to have the in residence.
Any members of the advisory committee have any questions about this proposed change?
Kind of seems like we're holding people from non-APA programs to a higher standard. The inconsistency there seems somewhat unusual.
This is actually the way that most of the professions standards, education standards are written. Because they go through the extra process and show that they meet APA accreditation or KCREP accreditation, they've met a higher standard than a program that is not APA accredited.
And Doug, I understand your concern on that. I do think it's tricky for us, and I think licensing bodies in general, because when a program goes through the accreditation process, there's many standards they have to meet. And if someone came from a program that is not accredited, we're asked to essentially have an alternate pathway for them. And I think if you look at some of the other professions under the regulation, we try to have program level requirements, we try to have coursework level requirements. And I am assuming that the accrediting bodies, they change their standards more frequently than we have changed our regulations in the past. And so we try to have sort of a general standard, although in some ways I'm sure the accreditation standards for APA are probably higher than our regulations. And in some ways, perhaps our regulations are higher in other ways, just because, we don't have the ability to go through the full accreditation review of these programs that they might go through if they were actually trying to become accredited. So it's not always apples to apples, unfortunately, but I understand your concern about that.
Yeah, what you're saying, it makes sense to me.
And when the committee discussed this in the past meetings, I did request that if this was approved, we could move it through the process now, because updating your regulation to meet current APA standards is going to take some time, because they have completely changed in how they do the accreditation. So, so if you guys are happy with this, if this, is what we discussed and you're okay with it, then I would ask that we go ahead and move forward with changing this part of the regulation. And then you would continue to do the rest of the regulation.
Do we need a formal motion?
I think it might be helpful to do that if there could be a motion on a specific change like this to the regulation.
Okay, well, that said, I will entertain a motion to accept the proposed regulatory changes for KAR 102-1-12, the educational requirements for psychologists.
I move we accept the proposed changes.
I have Doug as first. Do I have a second?
Yes, I approve it as well.
All right, and Mark seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. The motion passes. Thank you all for working on this. We have spent a few meetings discussing regulatory changes, and I think that this is something that will be really helpful in terms of clarification, in terms of the work that we do with the BSRB. And thank you, Dave, and thank you, Leslie, for all the hard work that you have put in to bring these changes to fruition.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Our next item, and I need to.
Richard, I'm sorry, there were a couple other possible items and the advisory committee doesn't have to move forward on these right now. I just wanted to make sure they were still on everyone's radar too, so.
Yes, please go ahead.
And this is, okay, these would be also items for consideration. So this one seemed pretty clear cut and it seemed like there was support last meeting. That's why Leslie went ahead and drew it up. And I think this one we could put forward. But in terms of future discussion or additional discussion at this meeting, there was a conversation about the definition of in residence and the educational regulation. The definition of in residence for that.
Hey, David,
Yes. Mhm.
are you sharing your screen?
I can go ahead and share it. Yeah, I think it might be helpful for us to take a look at the language. Okay, so this is our 102-1-12 educational requirements. And we talked a little bit about the requirement for the non-accredited schools as far as in residence. And currently the definition of in residence says when used to describe a student, it means that the student is present at the physical location of the institution for the purpose of completing coursework, during which the student and one or more core faculty members are in physical proximity and face-to-face. And so there was three issues. The first was, if someone came from an APA accredited school, do you want the in-residence requirements to still apply, in terms of their coursework and what they had to do? And that was what you just voted on. And so that piece has kind of been taken care of from the individuals that attended APA accredited programs. The second requested change, and this was not something that the BSRB requested the advisory committee do. This was something that we had heard from people as far as public comment who had asked the advisory committee to consider some of these changes. One would be potentially changing the definition of in residence. So 4 of the professions under the BSRB, social work, marriage and family therapy, addiction counseling, and professional counseling, changed the definition of in residence so that the specific reference to being at the physical location of the institution was removed. And secondly, it allowed for completion of the coursework in front of one or more core faculty members to be either in the physical proximity or by face-to-face contact by screen through synchronous video conferencing. So 4 of the professions have changed this for theirs, but the 2 other potential changes for the advisory committee to discuss would be, one, do you want to make any changes to the in-residence definition, such as the specific language here. Or if you wanted to make a smaller change, that would be sort of the third request. If the committee was not in favor of allowing the in-residence to be met through all online and synchronous video conferencing, one of the other flexibilities that was requested was just to remove the language that it be at the physical location of the institution. And the reason for this is because some individuals may attend an online program, but they receive some of their training at a physical location, such as conference centers or hotels. And so it is being done in person, but it's not being done at the physical location of the institution because there is no real physical location of the institution because of it being an online school. So it is still being done in physical proximity to core faculty, but there is no physical location of the institution. So that is the third thing that basically had been requested. So not to say that you need to make any recommendations on those two items, but those are the other two items that had been requested. So I just wanted to bring those back to the advisory committee and see if you wanted to have any discussion on those today or not. So
We had, I think, discussed this a little bit within the context of the last regulatory change. And I would want to know if members would like to have a brief discussion regarding a further discussion regarding the in-residence regulation. And I'm not,
I think it's worth discussing further.
Agreed.
okay. In terms of what Dave has proposed, I would want to entertain questions or comments regarding the proposal to change the definition of in-residence. Anybody want to kick off a discussion regarding this? And also, if you need to reference back to our previous discussion in August, that is, I think, perfectly reasonable to do.
and I'm trying to balance out being able to hear people's comments while also getting them a chance to do the language. So if you do want to weigh in, instead of raising your hand, feel free to start talking.
I was thinking, I can't remember everything that we talked about in August, though I think my primary concern with the whole idea is I think there needs to be some physical face-to-face interaction. So I'm not opposed to removing the concept of it having to be in a particular location, but it feels important that some educational material or something is happening with your educators, where the students are there with you.
So, Abby, if it said something like, it means that the student is at the physical location identified by the institution.
That I think is
Right.
nice.
Yeah.
Something like that. Well, and the weird side question, but does anybody know if there are any accredited universities that are fully online? Yeah, scratch that, programs that are completely online?
I don't know any in clinical psychology personally. I don't know any, but I really
Okay.
like the idea of the face-to-face.
Okay,
Like you were saying, I totally agree with that. I know I'm old-fashioned, but it's so important to have that face-to-face contact. And what else can I say? But I like the wording of what you just said. The way they worded it with the institution, and it doesn't have to be the actual institution, but at least the way you worded it just a moment ago sounded good.
Dr. Callis, did you mean APA accredited that's completely online or just from an accredited, regionally accredited?
I did, Leslie, sorry, APA accredited.
No, to my knowledge, Fielding is, there is a lot online, but they do meet in person. They just do it
Okay.
at different locations. They don't have a campus.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure before, because what I'm saying doesn't matter if there actually are accredited universities that have it completely online. But yeah, I agree. I like Linda's adjustment.
I have a quick question. is Capella APA accredited? And I thought that Capella was almost all online now.
I believe, hold on a second. I am looking up Capella, but I believe you're correct. I believe it is mostly online. But last I checked, it wasn't
It
accredited.
wasn't accredited. Okay.
Yeah.
I think their master's programs, the only accredited one APA for masters. I believe I saw that somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't look like it. And that is something also to consider the APA, my understanding is the APA accreditation standards for doctoral level and what they're looking at for master's level, that they don't have the same residence requirement for the master's level programs that they do for the doctoral level.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that they're accredited by the Higher Learning Commission, but I don't see notation of APA, and I would think they would identify that.
Capella is not APA accredited. Fielding is, and Fielding largely kind of advertises themselves as an online program, but like you said, they actually meet the requirement by doing some in-person meetings.
Okay.
And then the MA standards, as a lot of us are giving input right now, are changing because the APA accreditation process is moving forward for the master's level program. So that might alter some of that in the future. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on this discussion regarding the in-residence requirement?
I would just kind of echo what others have said. I like the idea of allowing them to use a physical location other than their own institution, but leaving the face-to-face for now. And we could always revisit if APA programs start to have all online, but for now, I like that.
That would also address your concern, Dr. Wright, about having higher standards.
Yeah, I think it makes it more fair. Yeah.
So the way in which, Linda, the way in which you phrased the augmentation, can you state that again so that we might take a motion on it and forward it to the board if the motion passes?
So it would read after the comma in the first sentence means that the student is present at the physical location identified by the institution for the purposes of. It would just be inserting identified by. It'd be getting rid of the word of and inserting identified by.
Okay.
That said, I'll take a motion to approve the change in language for KAR 102-1-12, and I don't remember the sub number under that, but what that may be. I'll take a motion to approve the change.
I approve it.
And I will second.
I think I heard Mark, then Abby. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, same sign. Motion passes.
Would you like me to put that in with the current change and move forward?
Because it takes a fair bit of time to get things through
Yeah.
the Office of Administration. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
And just to let our minutes takers know, that's in section 102-1-12A2.
Thank you. Was there anything else under that?
I don't believe so.
Well, we have wrapped up our discussion regarding education requirements for psychologists. And I want to thank all of you for your diligence in having this discussion over the course of the last couple of advisory committees. It's really going to be helpful, and I hope that this will allow for more people to get licensed in the state of Kansas. I'll move us on to the next item, and I need to pull up my agenda. Second item under old business, yes, the update on the survey for licensed psychologists.
Okay, so as an advisory committee, we had talked in the past. We are working with each of the advisory committees to develop a survey for licensees in their profession. And there's a number of different topics on that survey, which will be helpful for the BSRB. And a lot of the information, I think, will be helpful for the advisory committees to know what areas to focus on. So I just wanted to provide a real brief update. We are meeting with the last of the advisory committees, I believe this month, to try to get at least a good sense of the questions they would like to include on their surveys. And so the plan is that between now and your next meeting in December, we hope to send this out and collect that information. We're going to be using a survey tool, and it worked out pretty well the last time we did it for social workers. So I think we'll continue to use that. It's SurveyMonkey, and we will send an email from the BSRB before we actually send that out from SurveyMonkey. That way people can know if it goes to their spam folder, they can check that. But last time we did the survey of the social workers, and then we did follow-ups. I think out of the close to 8,000 social workers, we had responses from about nearly 3,000 of them. And so it's a pretty good response rate all in all. And so we will get that survey sent out probably sometime in the next month or so, and then try to put together a nice report for you to look at your December meeting.
Anyone have any questions regarding the survey? I do. I remember us having the discussion about the particular items that we wanted to include on the survey. I don't know if we had concluded the discussion about what would be the specific items that we would want to have on the survey.
Well, I can tell you in talking with the other advisory committees, it seems like some of those have been sort of somewhat standardized. There's going to be some differences with different professions, but I can tell you kind of the major topics that have emerged from the discussions and working with those different groups. So there were some questions that had to do with making sure we had a good sampling of responders. And part of that had to do with, what counties people practice in. If you practice in a predominantly urban area, rural area, or frontier area, and being able to define frontier and rural for individuals so that they would have a good definition of both. Trying to get an idea of which individuals are practicing in public practice, private practice, education, or other. In other professions where there's tiered licensure, we're going to ask them what their highest level of permanent license is, how many years they have practiced as a professional in this area, how many licenses they have between Kansas and other states. I think that's still helpful to get an idea. How many years they have held their license. And then we have some questions that deal with supervision. And we ask people, are you currently providing supervision? And if you're not, could you explain, why you're not providing supervision? We're trying to also get a sense of the percentage of time that individuals are providing direct services to clients, and probably including a definition of direct services. We've had a conversation about workforce with the board and in some other groups too. And while we have a count of licensees, we know that there are some individuals who hold multiple licenses. So counting each of those licenses for a 40-hour work week is probably not appropriate. But we also have individuals who may hold a license but not use it to provide direct services to clients. So they may be working in a different field, or maybe, spending a lot of their time on administration type work. So actually getting a sense of what percentage of time is being spent on services, direct services to clients would be helpful. Some of the other professions were asking about multi-state compacts and interest in that. So that may not be as relevant because of the SIPAC. Any practice-related issues that people have seen, such as areas where practitioners appear to need more continuing education training. Any issues, positive or negative, concerning telehealth, either through professional practice or observations. More issues that people have seen concerning receiving or providing supervision. There is one question that we were going to ask for people's familiarity with the work of the board and the advisory committees. Just kind of to put a spotlight on the work of the advisory committees and share more awareness of that. A question that had to do with, would you currently use artificial intelligence in your practice? And if you do, what areas or what tools do you use for artificial intelligence? And then sort of a general comment concerning if there's any areas that we didn't cover, but you want to provide some feedback to the board. There was kind of a general question as well. So those are the questions. And we were thinking about providing, splitting up the survey. And in the past, we've sent it out to everyone at once and then asked people to identify themselves based on if they were, bachelor's, social worker, or master's. But I think for your profession, there's one level of license, so that will avoid some of that. We will probably send one version to people who live in Kansas, and then one version to people who live outside of Kansas. That way we have sort of two different sets of results for those people. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Or the members, do you think it would be a good addition along with the telehealth question, if there was one other question that said, what percent of your practice is implemented via telehealth? Because I'm making this up, obviously, we might get 50 respondents that say they think telehealth stinks, but they spend less than 2% of their time doing telehealth services. I think that's important. What do you guys all think?
I would be in favor of having a sense of what percentage of someone's practice is a telehealth-based practice, as it's growing in use across not just Kansas, but across the country.
Right.
I would agree with that myself. Most of mine is face-to-face still, but I think that's a good question to include.
For the group, are there any profession-specific questions that we would want to ask of the licensed psychologists in Kansas? And I'm thinking about things like doing psychological assessment, and this is just sort of in broad strokes, engaging in consultation, engaging in program evaluations, and that kind of falls under administration. Anything that is typically unique to what it is that psychologists do.
I think if we have the ability to use, I don't know if you're using Qualtrics or RedCap or how you're doing this, but if you have the ability for people to be able to very easily choose categories or percentages of how they spend their time, I think it adds context to the data. If you're mainly you're 50% research, if you're 20% seeing patients, 30% supervising. Also, like you said, Richard, if you could break down, if we are very interested in where's the profession going, is hardly anybody in the state of Kansas now doing personality assessment, so neuropsych assessment, what is the breakdown for kind of some of those categories? I think that would be helpful and beneficial. And then we also kind of know, where do we need people? Is it that we really need people that are doing assessment in this area, or we really need gero psychologists, whatever the case may be.
As
No,
an
thank you,
add-on to
Chair. I'm
that,
writing it down.
I love that idea. Is there any potential to have a referral list built off of something like that?
On the survey?
Well, we already nominate our areas. I mean, I know we do that for the state of Kansas.
Yeah.
Yeah, along the lines of a assessment, I'd be interested in certainly the type, but also if people are providing assessments for various agencies like voc rehab or disability, and that intertwines with the others. But I think that just gets into kind of the areas of need. Are they private practice assessments? I know there's a huge in Southeast Kansas need for autism assessments because everyone gets referred to Kansas City or Wichita from this area for the most part. And so I guess just echoing, I think, the importance, and I think also really separates our field in a lot of ways.
And I don't know if this has been brought up with other aspects talking about the survey, but do we ask for folks that are maybe doing supervision or administrative supervision what they're supervising? Like, are they supervising assessment? Are they supervising clinical direct work? Are they supervising other psychologists? Are they supervising more of a whole clinic with other professions within the BSRB? That could be asked.
No, Chris, I don't think that we had delineated it that way. And I think that's a really good point, because there is the matter of being, say, a clinic director and you're overseeing other psychologists and other professions. And that's a whole different thing from providing supervision to a doctoral intern or to a postdoc.
One question that I would like to see, of course, I may be the only one of the group, I don't know, regarding question, how much training have you had in psychopharmacology? Not that we can prescribe medicine in Kansas yet, we can't, but 6 states allow people with training in psychopharmacology that pass their board exams to practice, like New Mexico and some other states. But just with such a shortage of psychiatrists and other prescribing professionals in the field of mental health, something along that line, I think, should be considered. Maybe not now, but down the road at least.
Mark, I think that's a good idea in terms of flagging that for future assessment, especially if it becomes the case that in Kansas, there would be a license for those psychologists who prescribe medication.
Yeah, even just having training, in the field, just to be aware, I think can enhance the professional's ability, even if they have no desire to learn to prescribe. I just feel like that's an important component. I see a lot of people that are on different medications, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I've been fortunate enough to go through the psychopharmacology training. And I just feel like that could be a benefit for licensed psychologists.
No, thank you. Anything else? And I would want to ask David and Leslie how we would want to go forward in terms of incorporating some of the ideas that have been brought forward into the survey. If you would want to talk offline in terms of crafting language, or if we would want to, it's 7:30 almost, and I really would like to get to the discussion about at least the professions and adding a descriptors to the website. We could have this teed up for our December meeting in terms of putting language together, or I'm thinking that there could be some crafting offline and folks could send in suggested language or suggested questions and we could return to it in our December meeting. Do folks have any particular thoughts as to how we should go about this? And I'm just being sensitive of the time because it's 7:30. Well, how about when it comes to the specific questions that we might want to ask that are profession specific, would you, David and Leslie, would you be open to receiving emails from the advisory committee? And I can also be CC'd on those emails so that we can kind of put them together and bring them back to the board, the advisory committee for our December meeting?
Yeah, so one thing we have to be careful of, if there is a majority of members of the advisory committee that are on an email, it can't be back and forth discussion. And so probably the cleanest way to handle it, if there's any advisory committee members who have thoughts on other questions, just go ahead and send an email to me, and you can copy Richard on that and Leslie too. And we will just kind of collect all those and then we'll just kind of discuss those and we can kind of bring those back for the December meeting. But rather than just kind of, sending it to all the advisory committee members, there's just maybe a little bit too much risk of back and forth, comments. So if you just send it to me, Richard and Leslie, I think that should be fine for the next meeting.
No, thank you, David. I appreciate that. And I thank all of you for, raising some really good questions that could be questions for the survey for psychologists here. That leads us to new business, unless there is any further discussion on this matter. All right, I'll move us on to new business. And the first point of new business, point A, is the discussion about adding descriptions for each profession to the BSRB website. And David, you foreshadowed a bit earlier, and I'll turn it back over to you.
So if you could go back in time about half an hour ago and recall what I had said previously, we are really looking to the advisory committee members as psychologists, in this case, to help us with some general language to help members of the public understand your profession. And so we have the technical definition of psychologist, and that does play an important role. We don't want to change that. That's in the statutes. But what we're trying to do is add more tools and resources on the BSRB website. So when someone comes to the website, we just have a general description of what is psychology or what is a psychologist. And so that's kind of what we're looking for. And we wanted to start with the advisory committee, see if you could help weigh in on that. Just a couple of things that some of the other advisory committees have discussed. A little bit of the perspective of the profession can be helpful. Maybe a little bit of the education that is required for this profession and the level of license. What psychologists are able to do is helpful as well. And then, for some of the other professions, there are limitations on what they're unable to do, but it really doesn't come into play since you have one level of licensure and it is at the independent level of licensure. So potentially you could talk a little bit about the difference between psychologists and psychiatrists if you wanted to go down that road, but more than anything, just kind of a general summary. And we're looking at maybe just like a paragraph or two that we can add to the website. And so that's really what we're looking at in terms of this kind of language.
So I'll take a quick moment to tell you all at least what Wikipedia says about clinical psychology. Clinical psychology is an integration of human science, behavior science, theory, and clinical knowledge for the purpose of understanding, preventing, and relieving psychologically based distress or dysfunction, and to promote subjective well-being and personal development. Central to its practice are psychological assessment, clinical formulation, and psychotherapy, although clinical psychologists also engage in research, training, consultation, forensic testimony, and program development and administration. So we do a lot of different things.
I think we should type it into AI and see what that comes up with, how to describe our profession.
You know, that's not a terrible idea, and that's the second part of, or the second point of under new business. And I think that will be a robust discussion, not just today, but I think that in our December meeting, that will be a pretty significant discussion. But I like the thought of it.
I think keeping it as simple and common language as possible, if this is for public consumption. What you just read sounded wonderful, but nobody's going to understand what that means, and they're going to learn nothing from it.
Nope.
To me, I think we want to hit the highlights of this profession holds a doctorate degree educationally, is able to practice independently, has the ability to diagnose and treat a wide variety of mental health illnesses, and is skilled and trained specifically in psychological testing. I think those would be some of the core highlight pieces, but to me, keeping it simple, because when we deal with other professions outside of mental health, they think we're crazy because we have so many, one, and we're all unique. And I think just trying to highlight what makes us a little bit more unique or different from others and keeping it simple would be my real broad stroke ideas.
I think also I agree 100%, but adding the fact of the years of education that we have to go through, I think is very important as well, versus say a social worker or a master's level person. I think the public should be aware of that too, what's involved in, as far as the length of education involved, having a supervised internship, many cases doing postdoctoral work, having a postdoctoral internship, etc. Somehow, but keeping it simple, but letting the public know that we're different with the years of many more years of education than most of the other professions.
I 100% agree, Mark. I think it's good to highlight how many years of, graduate education and the internship and postdoc training. I think that's great input.
Yeah, I agree with Mark and Doug. I think highlighting almost even the amount of hours that we're hitting the minimum just to become licensed within those educational years, the amount of practicums and the whole year-long internship before a degree. And we even do the postdoc. Most of us do.
Anybody else with any thoughts on what certainly should be included, or what we think is really important for the public to know about psychologists, either in training or in practice? Because I think that a fair bit of the discussion right now is kind of focused on the educational experience and the training experience. Is there anything that we would want to highlight that sets psychologists apart from other professions? And I think that Doug has hit on kind of the high points of that, especially with respect to psychological assessment. And that's, the cornerstone of the profession, even though there may not be a lot of people who are doing psychological assessments right now, to Jay's point. So,
Well, I think that you're part of the, Richard, you're part where you read the Wikipedia on some things that we do, forensic testimony and things like that. I think that might be important to include, among other things, right? Because, there's a lot of things that we can do. And then as well, just differentiating us from psychiatrists, because that's a common misunderstanding, right?
Yes,
Think we can prescribe, so.
No, I think that would be particularly important to include, because we do, I had a question asked of me just last week, like, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? And that is something that is not well known, I think, in the eyes of the public. I'm just writing a couple of things down here. Anyone else have any thoughts about what should be included in terms of the description of a psychologist for the BSRB website? We could start drafting language regarding this. I know that we're kind of putting ideas out for consumption right now. We could start writing some things down in this meeting. It may take a little bit longer than what we have left for the meeting, or we could table this and circle back to it for our next meeting and tee up a discussion about AI for the remainder, for the balance of this meeting. Does anybody have any strong feelings about which way to go?
I very much like to review it after it's been written. That's helpful to me. If we can write up the notes that you just took and start from that, I usually do best with that.
No, that's perfectly fine. And my notes are a bit kind of chicken scratch because I was writing quickly, and they're not full thoughts. But I think that the important points that we have discussed are the education that psychologists receive, and saying something about what is a psychologist in that regard. So a psychologist is someone who gets a PhD or a PsyD, and there are, as to Chris's point and others, there's a certain amount of education and in terms of practice that we have to go through before we get licensed as a psychologist. So saying something about the internship that we all have had to do, and in a lot of cases, the postdocs that we've taken. So there's that. There's the matter of what Tiffany said, and that is what are, in terms of the brass tacks of what psychologists do, we engage in assessment, we engage in psychotherapy, we engage in research, there's teaching, there's forensic testimony and administration. I would say, just as a privilege of the chair, I would say that well, let's see. Linda just sent an email. And the email, I should say, is a ChatGPT definition of what a clinical psychologist does. And I'm just briefly reading. Okay, so this contains a fair bit. And
well, there's three sections.
Yes.
What I put in to start with, it's underlined. It's the general description of clinical psychology, and that's pretty brief. And then the next one is where I typed in training requirements, right? Because, it's important for people to know the kind of training that we go through. And that's the next section there that starts with, it's a specialized field, and it gives 1, 2, 3, 4, the different degrees. And then the last one I put in, including professions and assessments. And then that next section is what came up when I put in those two key terms. So there's three there. That is a good base to start with. And then we could wordsmith it and include what we wanted and what we didn't.
How about we send this out to the members? How about we send this out to the members?
I didn't want to do that because, of all the restrictions on who we can talk to and who we can't. So I just sent it to you and Leslie and David.
No, and thank you for that. If we sent it out to the members individually, and we could do various markups of it and kind of come back to a discussion about this in December. I think that could be one launch point for getting thoughts to paper on this matter. I would be in favor of doing something like that, because this is a pretty, so the members know, this is a relatively long list of things, but it is, I think, it can give us a guiding light as to how to condense it and how we would want to present it to the public. Any objection to that? And thank you, Linda, for putting this into ChatGPT. I really appreciate it.
Okay. And so when you send it out, everybody, the part that's underlined is what was put into the keywords that was put into ChatGPT. And then the information following it is what it came up with. So there's 3 separate sections.
Any objection to that? Well, David and Leslie, I'll have y'all send this out individually to the members of the committee, and we can return to it in a discussion for our December meeting to kind of jigsaw puzzle this together. I really appreciate it. The next item, and I think that this is also going to be a longer discussion, and that has to do with the regulation of artificial intelligence. And David, did you have anything that you would like to lead off with from there?
Just that this is an item that the board is trying to approach in terms of how we can be helpful for members of the public and also to licensees. Artificial intelligence is something that is really growing in usage, and there's not specific language in the statutes and regulations for the BSRB, but a number of the national associations for the professions that we oversee have started to try to look to see how can we provide guidance. And some of them have started talking about best practices when use of AI, weighing things like wanting to make sure you're protecting confidentiality in terms of client information, in terms of what tools, and if you have confidential information, are you doing things appropriately to make sure that's not going places that you can't control? If you're using it to, make conclusions for you or different things like that, is that appropriate? So part of this process is about the board members and the advisory committees having a discussion about artificial intelligence, just to educate ourselves about what is artificial intelligence. And if there are speakers that on this topic that present information and you'd like me to reach out to them to maybe come and talk to the advisory committee so that we have a better understanding of AI and the tools that are involved with AI, I'm happy to do that. But ultimately, it's kind of trying to figure out what is the role of the BSRB in terms of this topic too. We generally don't come out with recommendations and best practice advice. We are more, our role is usually on the other end of the spectrum, to where if somebody does something that would constitute a violation as far as unprofessional conduct. And so we sort of operate usually under that lens. And so this could be something to where we have a discussion about artificial intelligence. We try to get an idea of who's using what tools that are out there. And then we try to figure out how to put a spotlight on this for practitioners and the unprofessional conduct regulations, or if there's another way that we can approach it, that would be good too. But ultimately, the board thought it would be helpful for each of the advisory committees to discuss this topic. And if the advisory committees can make recommendations back to the board on how the board can approach this, that could be really helpful.
I'm sorry, I'm writing just a couple of notes down.
Yeah. And I know, so David Stevens is the board's public member in this committee. And David is kind of in a unique role in that he serves on multiple advisory committees. And so he's heard some of the board discussion about this. He's heard another of the advisory committees kind of talk about this from master's level psychology. So, and I think, David, you kind of shared some comments just in general in your work outside of your role as a board member too, in terms of, AI and that kind of thing. And so I wondered if you might be able to share any thoughts with the advisory committee too.
Sure. I mean, the last committee meeting, there was some discussion about this, and part of the discussion just focused on the question of what is the regulatory kind of framework around AI. And I think primarily HIPAA provides the key for providers, generally speaking, when it comes to technology regulation. And in some of the discussion that I heard on the last committee, there was kind of a general sense of, well, it's just going to be inserted into our EMR software, and that'll be that. And I guess I do think there's a role for guidance to just help providers remember that any technology they use where they're sharing patient PHI becomes subject to HIPAA, and the covered entity in that framework is the provider. So even though they may think of that as just technology that their technology provider is responsible for, the fact is that they are the regulated entity, and it's their responsibility to make sure that they have appropriate contractual language with any technology provider they're sharing that PHI with. So, an easy example would be, well, if I just wanted to use ChatGPT to, transcribe a recording or something like that, I mean, you would basically be submitting PHI to an uncontracted technology provider, which would be a violation of HIPAA. And there are probably applicable state data privacy laws that I can't speak to off the top of my head, but I do think that that's an important framework to help providers think about, is that even though that technology is just going to start invading their space in their telephones and on websites and all kinds of ways it's going to become integrated, they need to be very cautious about how and it becomes integrated into their practice, and making sure that they have those appropriate contractual arrangements that subject whoever the technology company is to business associate language, and that kind of guidance. So I'll shut up now.
Yeah, very, very helpful comments. I appreciate you sharing those thoughts.
I'll weigh in. I think that I agree with everything that was just said. I think if the BSRB wants to take any sort of action, maybe it's an advisory bulletin reminding psychologists that all of our actions are governed by our regulations, including the use of technology such as AI. If there was ever going to be a regulatory change, the one thing that comes to my mind is something along the lines that psychologists do not substitute clinical judgment with AI, or do not use AI in substitution of clinical judgment, something along that line, because I think that's where it can get a little bit sticky, much like back in the day, and yes, I'm old, when we used a lot of computer-aided analysis for testing, and how that's not a substitute for your own analysis of testing. So I think maybe if we're going to do a reg, it'd be something along the line of that.
That's the first thing that came to my mind, Doug, when it comes to AI, and that is, we're the ones who do psychological assessments, and it is incumbent upon us to do the integration and interpretation, as opposed to artificial intelligence doing the integration of data and the interpretation of data. If there was going to be a regulatory change or an addition to the regulations, I would go down that route also. It can just get really, it can get really hazy. And David, David Fye and I had a conversation along with Linda. I remember this when we were at the ASPPB meeting last year. We had a conversation about just how far could AI go in doing the work of psychologists and what the frontier could look like for us.
I just want to throw out a little bit of an alternative viewpoint that I think it has its uses, and just like any other technology, I mean, it's really nice to have templates for reports. It's really nice, you know, some phrasing really doesn't need to be reinvented every time we write a report. Also, for folks with disability, particularly growing in our profession, AI can be a very helpful tool for them. Whether it's someone who's blind or someone that is deaf or hard of hearing. So I do think there are places for it. We just have to be thoughtful and intentional about how we move forward. And going back to what Doug said, you know, there are actuarial predictions that actually do a better job than human beings. So I think it's about integrating and acknowledging the use of technology, but certainly I'm open to the fact that AI may do a better job than me at some point in making predictions. So I'm ready for kind of that new frontier and to see what happens. I'm open to it. I don't think we're there yet, but that may come to pass.
I would agree, especially when you said, Sarah, about the acknowledgement of the use of technology. I think it's really important in whatever that we might do, that we correctly cite the source of the idea, and so in a way such that the consumer of the data, so our patients or our clients, we are transparent with them, and we also acknowledge our own agency when it comes to what it is that we have contributed to, whether it be a psychological report. I'm primarily thinking about psych reports, or it could be in other documents that we might that might be available for public consumption.
Well, and just from in between those two pieces of conversation, I'm aware of some programming in documentation devices that allow you to have the session recorded, and then it pops out a pre-populated piece of documentation that you can alter. But like, so it's the HIPAA piece of you're being recorded, and I don't know where that goes. And then the piece of you're not doing your own documentation, so there's no like clinical anything in that unless you adjust it and alter it. So it's both of those worlds. It's that middle ground, and I know people are already using that. Well, time to talk about it for sure.
And it is possible to have a HIPAA compliant system like that. But you know, the point was that you have to be intentional about that. Make sure that that's what you're signing up for, is a HIPAA compliant version of that. So.
Yeah, I'm pro AI, except when it comes to replacing clinical judgment, and when it becomes we're supervising bots to do the clinical work, I think is a huge concern for me. I think when somebody's in a suicidal crisis or mental health crisis, I think what's more important is a human is with them, not an AI bot. And if they don't know that either, I think that's even more harmful if we're trying to pretend with some of those chat features. So so those would be two things that I'd be open to, is making sure it doesn't replace clinical judgment. And in those severe cases, there's transparency, and it's not about replacing, you know, the work that we do when we have high need populations.
Mm-hmm. In terms of our discussion here, and I recognize that we are near the end of our time, we certainly can return to this conversation, and also if we wish to make advisory statements, we certainly could do that, and figuring out how that might be presented to the BSRB, or if we want to go as far as making any preliminary regulation changes, that's something that we can certainly discuss in our next meeting, and may take more than one meeting to kind of flush some of these things out. But I think that this is a really good beginning to the discussion around what is, as David said, what is the role of the BSRB when it comes to speaking to artificial intelligence, and if we so decide, regulating artificial intelligence within the profession. So I'm thinking maybe we could table this and come back to it in our next meeting. I'm seeing some nodding, and we are near the end. We have two, I think, agenda items left, and I think that we can probably hit them both. And pardon me, my computer is being very slow. David, I'll have you, if you could tee up the next item. I think that has to do with dates for next year.
Yes, it does. So traditionally, this advisory committee has met essentially every other month, the second Tuesday of the month at 6 p.m. And it's usually a 2-hour meeting. So usually it's between 6 p.m. and wrapped up by 8 p.m., sometimes a little bit earlier based on the schedule. So we were wanting to go ahead and put appointments out for next year and put those on your calendar already, but we wanted to have a conversation with the advisory committee just to make you aware that unless there is strong opposition, we would like to go ahead and continue at the current standard time. And then as long as it's not a real big issue, we'll go ahead and set up the Zooms for that and then get those scheduled and put on your calendar so you can prepare to attend these meetings regularly next year too.
Any objection to to maintaining the time at which we meet? Again, that's every other month on the second Tuesday of the month from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So it would look like February, May.
April.
No, April, and so on and so forth on the even number months.
Sounds good to me. I'm good with it.
All right, seeing no objection, the last item, actually, I because I didn't have my agenda pulled up, would be a longer discussion, I think, and that's a discussion on possible committee topics for 2025. David, if you want to just give a preview of that and we could then adjourn, how about we go there?
Sure. So we are reaching the end of the calendar year. And so with the advisory committee is asked to talk about recommendations. The board has referred to it. And then also, if they would like to make any recommendations to the board on other topics. So as an agency, we will do our part to bring sets of regulations to you that need to be updated. So that will be something for next year. We'll have some other regulations that haven't been updated or reviewed in a few years. But if it's other main topics you would like the advisory committee to start looking at or have discussion on next year, if you want to do for homework between now and the next meeting, be thinking of any topics you would like the advisory committee to focus on next year and bring those back to the meeting. And then if you talk about those in the next meeting, we can start to do a little research and bring back some items for discussion for sometime in 2025.
Any questions or thoughts about what David has proposed regarding a discussion on possible topics for 2025? I would advise one other thing with respect to that. If there are any thoughts about changing things in statute, I would certainly, I do think that we would need to talk about those at the December meeting because things would have to go to the revisor's office and go through committee and those sorts of things. So if there are any, statutory changes, regulatory changes are not exactly they're not in that process where it has to go through the legislature. But if there are statutory changes, anything that you see in statute that you think that we should discuss, and if we would want to get it on the docket for the legislature this year, that would be something that we for next year rather, we would need to discuss that expeditiously. All right. It is 2 minutes after 8 p.m. and we have reached the end of our meeting today. Unless there are any other questions, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Linda makes the motion. Do I have a second?
I second it.
That was seconded by a couple of people. I think that we all do want to adjourn. Thank you all for your time this evening. And our next meeting will be Tuesday, the 10th of December, 2024 at 6 p.m. via Zoom.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.
Y'all
Thank
take
Hey,
care.
y'all. Okay, bye-bye.